Imagine waking up feeling completely fine. You eat breakfast, you say goodbye to your family, you walk out the door, and then within 6 hours, you are dead. No warning, no time to say a proper farewell, no doctor who knows what is happening to you, no cure, no treatment, no explanation, just gone. And you are not alone. In the streets outside, your neighbors are dropping too, one by one, then 10 by 10, then hundreds, thousands, an entire city brought to its knees by something no one has ever seen before, something that seems to move through the air itself, through the water, through a simple handshake. Now here's the part that should truly unsettle you. This is not a hypothetical. This has happened before, many times, to some of the most powerful civilizations that have ever existed. Rome, Athens, medieval Europe, Tudor England, all of them humbled, hollowed out, and forever changed by invisible enemies that swept in, took their millions, and then, in some cases, simply ceased to exist, vanished, as mysteriously as they had arrived. Some of these diseases we have names for, some we barely understand even now with all of our modern science and genome sequencing and epidemiology, and a few of them, the truly strange ones, we do not know what they were at all, we may never know. That is what this story is about. Not just the suffering, not just the body counts as staggering as they are, but the mystery, the unanswered questions, the civilizations that crumbled, the history that was rewritten, the way ancient people tried to make sense of something that defied all logic and reason, and sometimes the terrifying ways they responded. These are 10 ancient diseases that wiped out millions, reshaped the world, and then either vanished completely or transformed into something we no longer recognize. Some of them you have heard of, some of them you have not. All of them deserve to be remembered, because if history has taught us anything, it is that the Earth has a long memory, and so do the microbes.
Let us start at the very beginning of Western recorded history, and the very beginning of recorded plague. The year is 430 BC. Athens is the jewel of the ancient world. The Parthenon is freshly carved. Democracy is a living, breathing experiment. Philosophy walks the streets. And then a disease arrives at the port that no one has ever encountered before. The city was already under enormous pressure. Athens was at war with Sparta in what would become the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenian statesman Pericles had ordered all the people from the surrounding countryside to shelter inside the city walls. The population density became extraordinary, exactly the kind of conditions a pathogen loves. Within months, something monstrous began moving through the cramped quarters of Athens. The Greek historian Thucydides described it in forensic, almost clinical detail, and what he wrote is still one of the most haunting accounts of disease in all of recorded history. People first experienced violent heat in the head, then inflammation spread to the eyes, then the throat and tongue began to bleed. Then sneezing, hoarseness, coughing, then the chest, then the stomach, then an uncontrollable urge to vomit, then a rash of small blisters and ulcers covering the entire body. Those who survived that stage faced extreme thirst and a restlessness so total they could not sleep, could not stay still, could not rest, even as their bodies burned. What makes this especially chilling is that Thucydides survived this disease himself and wrote about it. He noted something that modern epidemiologists still discuss. Those who recovered seemed to become immune. They could walk among the sick and nurse the dying without fear. They became the only ones brave enough to do so because everyone else fled in terror. And the doctors? They died at higher rates than anyone because they kept going back in. The disease likely killed somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the Athenian population. Among the dead was Pericles himself, the architect of Athenian democracy, which changed the political trajectory of the entire ancient world. Athens never fully recovered. The golden age that Pericles had built was over. So what was it? Historians and scientists have been arguing about this for centuries. Typhoid fever has become the leading candidate, supported by DNA evidence found in a mass burial pit in Athens. But others have proposed typhus, Ebola, smallpox, bubonic plague, and even measles. The honest answer is that we are still not entirely certain. Whatever it was, it appeared at full force and then faded, never claiming quite the same catastrophic toll again. The Plague of Athens was a one-time event that changed the course of Western civilization, and we may never fully know what caused it. Jump forward 5 centuries to the height of Roman power. The year is 165 AD. The Roman Empire spans from the rainforests of Scotland to the deserts of Mesopotamia. It is arguably the most powerful and organized political entity the world has ever seen. Its roads connect continents. Its army is the most feared on earth. Its trade networks stretch all the way to India and Southeast Asia. And then, Roman soldiers returning from a military campaign in what is now Iraq bring something home with them that no legionnaire bargained for. The disease arrived first in the east, then crept westward along the very same trade routes that had made Rome great. The more connected Rome was, the faster it spread. Think about that for a moment. The empire's greatest strengths became the vectors of its destruction. Its roads, its ports, its enormous cities packed with people, its mobile army, all of it created a perfect superhighway for an invisible enemy to travel at speed. The Greek physician Galen, arguably the most important medical mind of the ancient world, actually witnessed this outbreak firsthand. He described patients presenting with fever, diarrhea, vomiting, a swollen and inflamed throat, and then, by around the 9th day of illness, a rash of black pustules erupting across the entire body. The pustules dried up and scabbed over, leaving distinctive scars behind. Scholars have long debated the cause, with smallpox being the most widely accepted theory, though recent genetic analyses suggest the fully developed smallpox we know today may not have existed yet in this form, meaning this could have been a now extinct ancestor strain. The numbers were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that between 5 and 10 million people died, roughly 10% of the entire Roman population. In the city of Rome itself, at the height of the second wave in 189 AD, a historian named Cassius Dio recorded that 2,000 people were dying every single day. Every day, for months. The Roman army, that seemingly invincible machine, lost soldiers at a rate that Marcus Aurelius could not replace quickly enough. He had to do something almost unheard of for Rome. He recruited slaves into the military. He brought in barbarian fighters. He lowered the standards. The very institution that held the empire together was cracking. Marcus Aurelius himself, the philosopher-emperor, the man who wrote the Meditations while living through all of this, watched his world fall apart. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died of the disease in 169 AD, making him one of its highest-profile casualties. Marcus Aurelius continued to reign and to fight, but the plague that bore his family's name had planted seeds of decline that would take centuries to fully bloom. Most historians now argue that the Antonine Plague marks the beginning of the end for Roman imperial dominance, a crack in the foundation that never fully healed. History has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Rome was beginning to absorb the trauma of the Antonine Plague, just as the roads were being rebuilt, the army restaffed, the agricultural economy starting to recover, another plague arrived. And this one was different. This one was worse. The Plague of Cyprian is named after the Bishop of Carthage, a Christian leader named Saint Cyprian, who not only witnessed it, but wrote about it in vivid, terrifying detail. His account, in a document called De Mortalitate, leads less like a theological text and more like a field report from a war zone. Cyprian described victims suffering from burning eyes, feet and hands turning gangrenous and black, constant vomiting and diarrhea, a raging thirst that could not be quenched, limbs that began to die while the person was still alive. At the worst of it, 5,000 people a day were dying in the city of Rome alone. What was this disease? To this day, no one is entirely certain. Some researchers have suggested it was a filovirus, similar in nature to Ebola. Others propose pandemic influenza, typhoid, or a form of hemorrhagic fever. Archaeologists excavating a site in Luxor, Egypt, found a massive ancient burial site with bodies covered in lime, a disinfectant, dating to this exact period. They also found furnaces used to burn the clothes and belongings of the dead. The level of containment effort is extraordinary and suggests that even ancient peoples understood on some instinctive level that this thing was deeply contagious.
The plague of Cyprian lasted for roughly 20 years, returning in waves. It killed an estimated 1 million people just in Rome and Italy. It devastated the military. It triggered the period known as the Crisis of the 3rd century, during which Rome cycled through over 30 emperors in 50 years, most of them dying violently. The social, economic, and political fabric of the empire was fraying at every seam. And through all of it, Cyprian wrote that Christians should not fear death, that this plague was, in some ways, a release. His writings spread with the epidemic, and historians have noted that the plague may have dramatically accelerated the spread of Christianity across the Roman world, as desperate people searched for meaning in the chaos.
2.5 centuries after Cyprian, with Rome having fallen in the west and the Byzantine Empire carrying its legacy in the east, another plague arrives. But this time, we know exactly what it was. This time, modern DNA analysis has confirmed it beyond any doubt. This was bubonic plague, the same Yersinia pestis bacterium that would later power the Black Death of the Middle Ages. And in 541 AD, it was arriving in human populations that had never encountered it before. The Plague of Justinian, named for the Byzantine emperor who ruled during its emergence, began in Egypt. It traveled along grain ships carried by black rats whose fleas were infected with the bacterium. From Egypt, it moved to Constantinople, the greatest city in the world at that time, with a population of perhaps 500,000 people, and what happened there was indescribable. The historian Procopius recorded that at the height of the outbreak, 10,000 people were dying in the city every single day. The streets were filled with the dead. There was no room in the cemeteries. Soldiers were ordered to dig massive pits along the city's fortifications, and the bodies were stacked inside. When the pits filled up, corpses were left piled along the shores of the sea. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease and survived, one of the lucky few. His survival was considered miraculous by his subjects, and he continued to rule, but the empire he governed was hollowed out. The plague killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East over roughly 2 centuries of recurrent waves. It permanently reduced the population of the Mediterranean world and fundamentally altered the balance of power. The weakened Byzantine state struggled to hold its borders. The Sasanian Persian Empire to the east was equally devastated. Both of them were left vulnerable, and a few generations later, a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam, and swept through territories that the plague had cleared of the defenders who might otherwise have stopped it. Now we arrive at one of the greatest medical mysteries in all of recorded history. A disease so strange, so specific, and so complete in its disappearance that scientists still cannot agree on what it was or where it went. The summer of 1485, England has just endured the Wars of the Roses, one of the most brutal dynastic conflicts in its history. A Welsh nobleman named Henry Tudor has just won the Battle of Bosworth Field, killing the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, and seizing the throne as Henry VII. His army marches into London, and within weeks, a disease unlike anything ever seen in England begins moving through the population. People would wake up in the morning feeling completely fine. By midday, they had a violent headache. By late afternoon, they were profusely sweating. Their pulse raced. They felt an overwhelming, crushing exhaustion, a darkness behind the eyes, a terrible heaviness in the chest. And within 24 hours, sometimes within 2 hours, they were either dead or recovering. There was no middle ground. The disease killed between 30 and 50% of those it infected, and it moved with a speed that paralyzed entire cities. One of the most striking things about the sweating sickness was who it seemed to target. Unlike most diseases of the period, which were hardest on the very young, the very old, and the already weakened, this one seemed to prefer healthy adult men in the prime of life, often the wealthy, the powerful, the well-fed. It struck courtiers and nobles with frightening frequency, earning nicknames like Stop-Gallant and Stoop-Knave. During the 1485 outbreak in London, 2 Lord Mayors died, 6 aldermen died, 3 sheriffs. Henry VIII himself was so frightened that he postponed his own coronation. The disease returned 4 more times, in 1508, 1517, 1528, and 1551. The 1528 outbreak was so severe it crossed the English Channel and swept through Germany, Scandinavia, Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, killing enormous numbers before retreating back again. Notable figures throughout the Tudor court lost relatives to it. Anne Boleyn contracted it in 1528 and survived. Her brother did not. It is even possible that Arthur Tudor, the elder brother of Henry VIII, may have died of it in 1502, a death that changed the entire succession and, by extension, triggered the English Reformation. And then, in 1551, it came one last time and disappeared completely. No recurrences, no gradual fading, just gone. Scientists today believe it was likely caused by a hantavirus, a type of virus spread through rodent droppings, which would explain both its pulmonary symptoms and its geographic concentration. But why it appeared 5 times and then ceased to exist in England, we genuinely do not know. It is impossible to talk about ancient diseases and their devastating power without confronting what happened when European diseases crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Because what followed was not just a pandemic, it was a biological catastrophe of a scale so immense it is difficult for the modern mind to fully process. Smallpox had existed in Europe and Asia for thousands of years. Evidence of it has been found in Egyptian mummies over 3,000 years old. The mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V, who died in 1157 BC, shows distinctive marks on the face and neck that multiple medical experts have identified as smallpox pustules. The disease had been circulating in the Old World so long that the populations there had, over centuries, developed a degree of partial immunity. Not perfect immunity, smallpox still killed millions in Europe, but enough that societies could function, could survive, could keep their populations roughly stable despite periodic outbreaks. The peoples of the Americas had no such immunity. They had been geographically isolated from Europe and Asia for tens of thousands of years. Their immune systems had never encountered smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, or dozens of other diseases that European colonizers carried with them. And so when Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in 1519, they brought something far more destructive than their horses or their guns.
Think about what that actually looked like on the ground. A village of 1,000 people. A stranger arrives. A trader, a soldier, a missionary, carrying something he himself may not even be sick from, because Europeans had enough exposure to carry the virus without always developing the worst symptoms. Within weeks, half the village is feverish. Within a month, 80% of them are dead. The survivors, many of them children, have watched every elder, every knowledge keeper, Every person who knew how to plant crops or conduct ceremonies or navigate the rivers simply die. They are left with a world they do not know how to rebuild, surrounded by the dead, with no explanation and no framework to understand what has happened. And then the next wave comes. This happened not in one village, but across an entire continent, repeatedly, for over a century. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, at the time one of the largest cities in the entire world, was ravaged by a smallpox epidemic in 1520 that killed tens of thousands, including the emperor, Cuitlahuac, who had only just taken power after Moctezuma's death. It is estimated that the indigenous population of North and South America declined from somewhere between 50 and 100 million people to fewer than 6 million within about 150 years of sustained European contact. That is a demographic collapse with no equivalent in human history. It permanently altered the ecology of the Americas. So many people had died that the farmland they managed returned to forest, a reforestation so dramatic that some climate scientists believe it contributed to a global cooling event in the 17th century. Smallpox was eventually eradicated through one of humanity's greatest collective scientific efforts, the global vaccination campaign of the 20th century, which ended in 1980 when the World Health Organization declared it eliminated. The virus now exists only in 2 laboratories on Earth, one in Atlanta and one in Moscow. It is the only human disease ever deliberately driven to extinction, and it took nearly 200 years from Edward Jenner's first vaccine in 1796 to make it happen. That is how formidable this ancient enemy was.
Not all the ancient afflictions that swept through populations and vanished were caused by conventional pathogens. Some of the strangest episodes in medical history fall into a category that blurs the line between physical disease and something far more unsettling: the power of the mind, collective trauma, and the way suffering can manifest in ways that look entirely biological, but are driven by something else entirely. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman named Frau Trophea walked into the street and began to dance. Not joyfully, not deliberately. She danced without music, without apparent choice, as if her body had been commandeered by some outside force. She danced for days. When her feet bled, she kept dancing. When she collapsed from exhaustion, she rose again and danced. Within a week, 30 more people had joined her. Within a month, the number had climbed to 400. Physicians at the time, mystified, concluded that the only cure was more dancing. They set up stages and hired musicians, believing the afflicted simply needed to exhaust the impulse out of their systems. They were catastrophically wrong. People were dancing themselves to death. Some historians estimate that by September, the dancing plague had claimed up to 15 lives per day to heart attacks, strokes, and sheer physical exhaustion. What was it? Modern scholars believe this was a case of mass psychogenic illness, a collective stress response where genuine physical symptoms spread through a traumatized community like a contagion. The region had been devastated by famine, disease, and the brutal religious conflicts of the early Reformation. People were experiencing levels of chronic stress that the human body simply cannot sustain. The dancing was, in a disturbing way, a mass breakdown, a physical manifestation of collective despair that the body expressed because there was no other way to release it. By October, it had simply stopped. The dancers returned to their lives, those who had survived, and the dancing plague of Strasbourg was never repeated. To this day, nothing quite like it has been definitively documented since. In the years immediately following the First World War, a period already defined by unimaginable suffering, loss, and collective trauma, a strange new illness began spreading across the world, and this one was unlike anything medicine had ever encountered. Not in the suffering it caused, though that was severe, but in what it did to its victims. Because this disease did not simply kill. In many cases, it froze people, alive, aware, and unable to move or speak for decades. Encephalitis lethargica, also called the sleepy sickness, was an inflammation of the brain that presented in bizarre and wildly varying ways. Some patients fell into a sleep so deep that they could not be roused, lying in hospital beds for months, their bodies still functioning, their hearts beating, but their minds locked behind a door with no handle. Others went in the opposite direction, developing severe insomnia, uncontrollable tics, and violent episodes of psychosis.
Some entered a state of suspended animation, aware of their surroundings, able to see and hear everything happening around them, but entirely unable to initiate movement or speech. They were, in every meaningful sense, imprisoned inside their own bodies. Between 1915 and 1928, roughly 5 million people worldwide were affected. About a third of them died in the acute phase, but another large fraction survived in these frozen states, some of them for decades. The neurologist Oliver Sacks found a population of these survivors still living in a hospital in New York in the 1960s. People who had been locked in stillness since the 1920s, 40 years of their lives passing while they watched from the inside. Sacks treated them with a new drug called L-Dopa, and many of them briefly awakened, speaking, recognizing themselves and each other after 40 years of frozen silence. It was extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure, and Sacks documented it in a book and later a film called Awakenings.
And then, in 1928, the epidemic simply stopped. No vaccine, no treatment that definitively worked, no clear understanding of what had caused it. The most widely held theory today is that it was triggered by a strain of influenza, possibly related to the catastrophic 1918 flu pandemic. Others have suggested it was an autoimmune response, the body attacking its own brain cells after an infection. But the cause has never been definitively established, and encephalitis lethargica has not returned in epidemic form since. The surviving patients aged and died, and with them went the last living witnesses to one of medicine's greatest unresolved mysteries. Any honest accounting of ancient diseases that reshaped civilization must spend real time with the one that arguably changed the world more than any other. Not the Antonine Plague, not even smallpox in the Americas, but the disease that in a span of roughly 3 years reduced the entire population of Europe by somewhere between a third and half, the Black Death. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried on merchant ships that docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Sailors aboard were either already dead or dying, with strange swellings the size of eggs bulging from their armpits and groins. The swellings were black and oozing. Officials ordered the ships out of the harbor, one of the earliest recorded examples of a quarantine, but it was already too late. The pathogen was ashore. What followed is nearly impossible to describe in terms that do justice to its scale. By 1350, Venice had lost roughly 60% of its population. Florence went from 110,000 people to perhaps 50,000 within 18 months. In some rural areas of France and England, entire villages simply ceased to exist. The buildings standing, the fields fallow, every person inside dead and unburied. Contemporary accounts describe roads lined with corpses, churches so full of the dead that priests could no longer enter, the living so overwhelmed that formal burial rites, one of the most sacred human activities, simply stopped. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the worst of it, described people finding themselves completely alone in their own homes, every member of their household dead around them, with no one coming because everyone else was equally alone and equally terrified. He wrote these accounts while compiling the Decameron, one of the great works of Italian literature, as a way of preserving something human in the middle of absolute chaos.
What is less remembered is what came after, because the Black Death, for all its horror, also unleashed forces of change that reshaped Europe in ways that would take centuries to fully unfold. The severe labor shortage that followed the plague fundamentally altered the power dynamics between peasants and landowners. When half the workers are dead, the survivors can negotiate, they can leave, they can demand better conditions and wages. The feudal system, that rigidly hierarchical structure in which peasants were essentially bound to the land they worked, began to crack. The plague dealt it a blow from which it never fully recovered. In this dark and terrible way, the Black Death contributed to the gradual liberation of millions of ordinary people from a form of serfdom that had persisted for centuries. The Black Death also shattered trust in institutions. The Church, which had held such enormous moral authority, was unable to explain or stop the plague. Priests died like everyone else. Prayers seemed to have no effect.
The flagellant movement emerged, groups of devout people who would march through towns whipping themselves bloody, believing that if God was punishing humanity for its sins, the only response was to demonstrate the most extreme possible penitence. The spectacle of processions of bleeding, chanting penitents moving through plague-emptied streets is one of the most surreal images in all of European history, and it speaks to the depths of psychological fracture that the Black Death caused. The disease did not vanish. Bubonic plague still exists today, caused by the same Yersinia pestis bacterium. What changed was not the pathogen, but the conditions that allowed it to reach such catastrophic scale. As urban sanitation improved, as rat populations and human living spaces declined, as medicine advanced, the plague was pushed back. It still claims lives annually, primarily in parts of Africa and Central Asia, but it never again achieved the conditions that allowed it to kill a third of a continent in 3 years.
We have talked about plagues that historians have named, that left enough evidence for scientists to identify or at least theorize about. But there is a final category that perhaps deserves the most attention, precisely because it is the most unsettling. These are the diseases for which we have almost no answers at all. Ancient texts from multiple civilizations reference epidemics that do not match any disease we currently recognize. The Plague of Athens, as we discussed, remains contested. The Plague of Cyprian is still unidentified with certainty. The sweating sickness has never been definitively explained. And then there are references in sources from China, the Middle East, and ancient India to epidemic events described in such fragmentary terms that we can't even begin to categorize them. Episodes of mass illness that swept through populations, killed enormous numbers, and then faded from both the world and the historical record. Consider what this means. The pathogens that caused these outbreaks existed. They were real biological entities, real viruses or bacteria or parasites that evolved, spread, mutated, and then either went extinct or retreated into an animal reservoir somewhere or transformed into something unrecognizable. Evolution does not stop. The microbes that devastated ancient Athens or medieval England are not frozen in time. They changed, they adapted, and in some cases they may still be out there, dormant in rodent populations, preserved in permafrost, circulating at low levels in ecosystems that we have not yet fully mapped.
This is not a call to panic. Modern medicine is extraordinarily powerful. The tools we have built, vaccines, antibiotics, antiviral medications, surveillance systems, global coordination networks, represent a genuine triumph of human ingenuity. We have eradicated smallpox. We have nearly eliminated polio. We have turned HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. These are real victories, and they should be acknowledged honestly. But they should not make us complacent. Every one of the diseases in this story emerged in a world that didn't expect it, in a population that had no immunity to it, in a society that didn't have the tools to stop it. Every emperor, every philosopher, every physician who watched their city empty out was living in a world that felt to them stable and permanent. They had no way to know how quickly everything could change. The lesson of ancient plagues is not that we are powerless. The lesson is that we are never finished. That vigilance is not paranoia, it is intelligence. That understanding history, understanding how these invisible forces have shaped empires, toppled dynasties, and redirected the entire course of human civilization is one of the most important things we can do.
Because the diseases that vanished did not necessarily disappear forever. Some of them may simply be waiting. And the best weapon we have against whatever comes next is the same one that every civilization in this story eventually discovered, sometimes too late. Knowledge. The willingness to study, to document, to learn, to share what we know, to build systems of protection before we desperately need them. The people of ancient Athens did not know what was killing them. We do. And knowing, really knowing, and acting on that knowledge is the difference between a civilization that survives and one that becomes a cautionary tale.
These 10 ancient diseases are not just medical history, they are a mirror. They reflect back at us something fundamental about the human condition, our fragility, our resilience, our capacity for both extraordinary compassion and catastrophic cruelty in the face of fear. They show us what happens when the invisible wins, and they remind us with a weight that no textbook can fully capture that the world we live in has been shaped as much by pathogens as by politics, as much by microbes as by monarchs. We are the descendants of the survivors. Every single person watching this, your existence is proof that somewhere in your family line, someone made it through. Someone survived the plague pits of Constantinople, or the sweating sick rooms of Tudor London, or the devastation that followed the ships from Europe to the Americas. They survived so that you could be here, in this moment, watching the world they helped to shape. That is not a small thing. That is everything.